Welcome, everyone, to our fun little study group for PP 5340 Introduction to Public Policy and Management. Today, we're diving into the required texts, race, and social equity, a nervous area of government. We're focusing specifically on Chapter 5.
Right. And Chapter 5, well, it lays out a really significant case study for anyone in public policy. We're talking about the City of Seattle's journey with their Race and Social Justice Initiative, the RSJI.
Yeah, it's quite pioneering. So our mission today is basically a deep dive, right? We want to pull apart Seattle's effort over, a decade to tackle institutionalized racism within the city government itself.
Exactly. We're looking at, the politics behind it, the courage it took, how they actually did it, the implementation strategies, and crucially, what came out of it, the tangible results.
That political courage piece jumps out right away. The source material kicks off with this quote from former Mayor Greg Nichols, and it really sets the scene. He said, lots of people told me not to do this. It will only make people angry. But I thought we had a responsibility to do it.
Mm-hmm. That tells you a lot.
Yeah.
It wasn't just another policy paper. It was a deliberate, politically charged choice. Very risky.
Definitely.
And the RSJI, which they launched back in 2004, it wasn't like a surface-level diversity thing. The core mission was huge. Prioritize racial justice in how the government actually delivers services and, this is the key part, explicitly aim to eliminate institutionalized racism.
That doesn't sound like standard operating procedure for a city back then.
Not at all. It was pretty radical, actually.
So, we look at a lot of case studies. Sometimes they're big on promises, but maybe fizzle out. What makes this Seattle RSJI thing stand out so much that we're studying it now?
Well, the chapter points to three things that really make it significant, even nationally.
Mm-hmm.
First, it was designed by the local government itself specifically to root out institutional racism within its own operations. That's a big admission right there.
Yeah, admitting the problem is internal.
Right. Second, and this is huge for us policy students, it's been kept alive since 2004. It survived multiple mayors, different political wins. It actually outlasted the guy who started it. That kind of sustainability is rare.
Okay, that is impressive. Longevity matters.
And third, the impact. It wasn't just symbolic. It fundamentally shifted how Seattle's government works on the inside. And because of that, it's become kind of a roadmap for other cities facing similar, deep-seated equity issues.
Okay, so let's unpack all that. Where do we start? Maybe with why they even need it in the first place.
Yeah, let's set the stage.
Seattle. You think progressive, right? Tech money, pretty liberal reputation. But the sources, they paint a really different picture. A city divided by race, needing something drastic like the RSJI. What was actually going on? What did that before picture look like?
It's quite stark when you look at the data they presented. It really cuts against that progressive image. The sources lay out these severe, quantifiable disparities based entirely on race.
Like what specifically?
Okay, take jobs, economic inclusion. At the time they launched this, the unemployment rate for African American men in Seattle, it was on par with the national unemployment rate during the Great Depression.
Wow, that's staggering. Not just a small gap.
No, not at all. We're talking about a massive structural failure, locking people out of opportunity. And that kind of exclusion, you just can't blame that on individuals. It screams institutional barriers.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just jobs. You saw it everywhere. Immigrant and refugee communities facing huge inequities in housing, stable jobs, education, even health outcomes. Plus, the chapter makes a really important point about Asian Pacific Islander communities. If you just lump everyone together, the stats might look okay, right? Strong overall.
Yeah, that happens a lot. Aggregated data hides things.
Exactly. But it masks profound disparities within specific groups. And that's critical for policy work, right?
Yeah.
You have to disaggregate the data to see the real picture.
So true. And maybe the most heartbreaking evidence was in the schools.
Yeah, the education pipeline, the data showed only about half, just 50% of Samoan, Native American, Latino, and African American students were actually graduating from Seattle public schools.
Half. That's basically the system failing those kids.
It points to a system not serving non-white students effectively. Yeah. And then look at how jobs and the justice system intersected. This one data point is powerful. An African American person without a criminal record had a harder time getting hired than a white person with a criminal record.
Okay, that right there tells you bias is baked into the hiring system somehow.
Deeply. Plus, almost a third of Native Americans in Seattle were living in poverty. So the whole point of RSJI wasn't just to patch these things up. It was to change the underlying system that was actively creating and maintaining these inequities day after day.
So the target had to be laser focused. They called it institutional racism. How did they define that term for their purposes to make it actionable, not just academic?
They were very specific. The definition they used was organizational programs, policies, or procedures that work to the benefit of white people and to the detriment of people of color, usually unintentionally or inadvertently.
Okay, organizational programs, policies, or procedures, and usually unintentionally. That's key, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. It
Yeah.
shifts the whole conversation. It's not about finding individual racists. It's about finding the racist rules in the organizational handbook, the bias procedures.
Right. It's not about making Bob in accounting less biased necessarily, but about rewriting the accounting procedures if they create biased outcomes.
Precisely. And this distinction is so important for us studying public management. The RSJI explicitly said, we are not just another diversity workshop, not another cultural competence training about feelings.
Ah.
They saw those older things like equal employment opportunity, EEO programs. They saw them as necessary, sure, but totally insufficient. EEO mostly looked at fairness after the policy was already in place. RSJI aimed to change the policy itself, to screen it before it even went out the door to check for negative racial impacts.
So proactive system change versus reactive compliance.
That's a perfect way to put it. Systemic versus compliance.
Okay, so RSJI kicks off in 2004. But big changes like this don't just appear out of nowhere, right? The chapter talks about laying the groundwork. What came before? What was the political history there?
Yeah, nothing happens in a vacuum, especially in politics. You got to look back to Mayor Norman Rice. He was in office from 1990 to 1998. Big deal because he was Seattle's first and still only African-American mayor.
Okay, and what did he do?
He really planted the seeds for thinking about equity as a government job. His administration pushed for things like making sure utility rates from Seattle City Light were equitable. They set up the Women and Minority Business Enterprise Ordinance, WMBE, trying to get city contracts to more diverse businesses. They even got involved in anti-apartheid investment policies.
So he started normalizing the idea that city services should be viewed through an equity lens.
Exactly. He established that precedent. Then, after Rice, came Mayor Paul Schell. His term was pretty rocky. Remember the WTO protests in '99?
Yeah.
And then the Mardi Gras riots?
Yeah, that was a tough time for the city. Lots of tension.
Huge tension. But despite all the political heat he took, Schell did something really important that kind of set the stage for RSJI later.
What was that?
Well, after those Mardi Gras riots, which had major racial undertones, Schell started these things called City Talks. And he brought in this group from New Orleans, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond.
Okay, I've heard of them. They do serious anti-racism organizing, right?
Very serious. And bringing them in, it did something crucial. It started a public conversation, but maybe more importantly, an internal conversation within city government itself about race, not just as individual incidents, but as a systemic problem. It got staff thinking in terms of structural injustice.
So it laid some intellectual groundwork. Interesting. But then comes this twist, right? This counterintuitive catalyst. Washington State passes Initiative 200 in 1998.
Yeah, I-200. Basically, it banned affirmative action.
Yep.
It said the state couldn't give preferential treatment based on race, sex, color, etc. in public hiring, education, contracting.
Logically, you'd think that would just kill any race-focused initiative in Seattle dead in the water.
Right. That's what you'd expect. But here's the fascinating policy paradox. According to the sources, city employees actually argued that I-200 pushed them toward RSJI.
How did that work? Banning affirmative action leads to a stronger race initiative.
It sounds backwards, but the logic was.
Mm.
Because I-200 made traditional affirmative action, the kind focused on numerical goals and targets, legally risky, maybe impossible. It forced them to get creative. They couldn't just aim for numbers anymore. They had to go deeper. They had to adopt a more systemic approach, one focused on dismantling the root causes of the disparities, the bias policies, the institutional barriers, things that were maybe more legally defensible than explicit quotas.
Wow. So the legal constraint actually sparked innovation towards a more fundamental solution. That's a great lesson for policy folks.
It really is. Sometimes constraints force you to think bigger.
Okay, so with that background, let's look at the core principles they built RSJI on. The chapter has Table 5.1 outlining them. What were the key strategic choices they made right at the start?
They made 4 really deliberate choices. First, they were super explicit. Focus on race and institutional racism.
Just race, even though other things matter, like class or gender.
They acknowledged those other things, yes. Class, gender, sexuality, disability. They knew these intersected with race. But they made a strategic choice to keep the focus tight, laser-sharp on race initially. The idea was, let's tackle this specific massive problem first, based on the data we have.
Okay, that makes sense. Keep it focused. What was the second principle?
Second was scope, getting our own house in order first. They decided to concentrate their efforts inside city government.
Why start internally?
The thinking was pretty straightforward. If the city government itself can't fix its own racism in hiring, contracting, and how it delivers services, then it has zero credibility telling the private sector or the wider community what to do. Lead by example.
Right. Clean your own backyard first. Makes sense. And the third?
Third was about expectations. Commit to this being a long-term project. No quick fixes. They knew changing a huge bureaucracy, changing deep-seated ways of doing things, that takes years, maybe decades, not just one budget cycle. So long-term commitment was baked in from the start.
Important to manage expectations. And the last one?
Finally, they used a community organizing model inside the government. This wasn't just top-down mandates. They intentionally built buy-in and capacity from the ground up. They created networks of employees at all levels. These change teams we'll talk about, who could actually champion and implement the work within their own departments.
So, top-down mandate plus bottom-up organizing. Interesting combination. Okay, so the principles are set, but putting them into action required real political will. Mayor Nichols seems central here. He saw that racial chasm in Seattle and decided to force the issue.
Absolutely. He provided the critical top-level mandate, and his insistence on using the exact words race and social justice was apparently a big deal.
Why was the specific phrasing so important?
He knew instinctively or through advice that if they called it something softer, like, equity initiative or income fairness project, people would avoid the hard part. Exactly. Employees in departments would naturally drift to easier topics, talk about class instead of race, talk about vague equity instead of confronting structural white privilege and institutional racism head-on. Naming it directly prevented that deflection.
Smart, but probably made some people very uncomfortable.
Oh, definitely. It came with real political risk. And you see that reflected in the story about the first director of innovation they hired to conceptualize this whole thing.
Yeah, what was that about?
This director, hired specifically for this, immediately saw how difficult the job was going to be. They told the mayor, look, white staff are going to see me as a threat, challenging their position. Staff of color might see me as an Uncle Tom, thinking I'm not pushing hard enough, or that this is just cosmetic.
Wow. Caught between a rock and a hard place.
Totally. And the mayor's response was basically, yep, that sounds about right. That's the job. It just shows the incredibly sensitive, high-stakes environment they were stepping into.
Okay, but the really serious, almost show-stopping resistance came from somewhere else, right? The lawyers?
Oh, yeah. The city attorney's office. This is where the institutional antibodies really kicked in.
What was their problem with it?
It was all about legal liability. Pure risk aversion. They initially told the mayor's office, you absolutely cannot use the term institutionalized racism publicly.
Why not? Because it sounds bad.
Worse than that, their argument was, if the city of Seattle officially states in policy documents that its own systems are institutionally racist, that's basically a massive public admission of guilt.
Ah. So in any future discrimination lawsuit?
Exactly. The plaintiff's lawyers would just hold up the city's own documents and say, see, they admit it. The city attorney's office felt it would leave the city completely defenseless, legally speaking. It was a fundamental conflict. The policy folks wanting to name the problem, the legal folks trying to minimize exposure.
That sounds like it could have killed the whole thing right there. How did Nichols get past that? Did he just overrule them?
He basically used his political capital, his muscle, as the source puts it. He made it crystal clear that tackling the systemic racism was the non-negotiable priority. The lawyer's job wasn't to stop it, but to figure out how to manage the risk while doing it.
So he shifted their mandate from prevent risk to manage risk in service of the goal.
Pretty much. He wouldn't let legal prudence completely derail the policy ambition. It took unwavering support from him and eventually getting the city council on board too. But they did get the city attorney's office to shift from opposition to finding ways to support the initiative. They had to adjust their strategy.
That political cover was everything then.
Absolutely crucial. And that mandate also created this interesting dynamic for the initial training they rolled out. They called it the captive audience.
Captive audience, meaning?
Well, the initial big 8-hour anti-racism training was mandatory, mandated by the mayor. And it happened during work hours. So unlike some optional workshop, employees couldn't just skip it or walk out if they felt uncomfortable.
Oh, they had to be there.
They had to be there. It was part of their job. So even the most resistant or skeptical employees were, at minimum, exposed to the core concepts. They had to sit there and hear about institutional racism, structural inequality. It forced at least some level of engagement, even if grudgingly at first.
Okay, so the political will is there. The legal hurdles are navigated, albeit nervously. Now the actual work begins. The implementation responsibility fell largely on the Seattle Office of Civil Rights, SOCR. That sounds like a huge shift for them.
Oh, massive. SOCR was, traditionally a civil rights enforcement agency.
Mhm.
They mostly handled complaints, investigated discrimination case by case, reactive stuff.
Right, like most city civil rights offices.
Exactly. But now they had to become the engine for citywide systemic change. Proactive, policy-focused, analyzing internal procedures across all departments. That's a totally different skill set, a different mission.
So how did they gear up for that?
They had to build a whole new infrastructure, basically. This included setting up a citywide core team, about 40 people initially, who were specially trained not just in the concepts, but in how to facilitate really difficult conversations about race, how to do institutional analysis, how to help departments actually problem solve.
And the training itself, mandatory for all, 8,000 city employees?
Yeah.
Starting at the top.
Yep, everyone.
Yeah.
Senior management went first, which is key for signaling commitment. And the curriculum leaned heavily on that PBS documentary series, Race, The Power of an Illusion.
Why that series specifically?
It was a strategic choice.
Yeah.
That series does a really good job of using science, genetics, anthropology to just dismantle the whole idea of biological race.
Mhm.
It shows race as a social construct, not a biological reality.
Okay, so step one, race isn't real biologically.
Right. But step two, and this is the crucial part the training focused on, even though it's a social construct, it has had profound, real-world institutional consequences. The training used the film to make visible those, quote, underlying social, economic, and political conditions that disproportionately channel advantages and opportunities to white people.
Ah, so it connects the social construct to the systemic outcomes.
Precisely. And that laid the groundwork for the really tough part, confronting white privilege directly.
Which brings us right back to that nervous area of government. This sounds like where policy hits raw emotion. What was that experience like for people in the training, especially folks who maybe never had to think about this stuff professionally?
The sources are pretty clear. It was often intensely emotional. People reported feeling really uncomfortable. There was silence, sometimes conflict, even anger.
I can imagine.
A common theme, especially for white employees, maybe from middle-class backgrounds, was this profound discomfort in facing the fundamental unfairness of a system they might have benefited from without even realizing it. That forced look in the mirror confronting unearned advantages that created a lot of organizational tension.
Okay, so if it's causing conflict, anger, making people uncomfortable, why keep doing it? How did managers justify that? Surely they saw the tension.
They absolutely saw it. But the leadership, guided by the RSJI framework, viewed that tension as not just predictable, but actually necessary.
Necessary. How so?
Well, there's a great quote from a manager in the text. You can't do this deep work without cracking open a few eggs and having discomfort. The feeling was you have to get past that Seattle nice politeness, that tendency to avoid conflict at all costs, because that politeness often masks the real systemic problems. The tension was a sign that they were actually hitting a nerve, getting somewhere real.
So the discomfort was part of the process, not a sign it was failing.
Exactly. The goal wasn't to make everyone feel good immediately. The goal was to get the issues out on the table, even if it was messy.
And the long-term hope was what? That people would just get used to being uncomfortable.
Sort of. The idea, thinking about the organizational life cycle, was to normalize these difficult conversations, to build shared language and understanding so that over time, people could move past the initial shock or defensiveness. They could loosen up, as the text says, and actually start doing the analytical work needed to change the systems.
Make the uncomfortable normal work.
Make it part of the job, yeah. The mandatory training, while tough, forced that initial normalization. It created a baseline understanding across the whole organization.
And did it work? Did people eventually come around?
The data suggests it did have a significant impact over time. By 2010, so about 6 years in, surveys showed 83% of city employees found the training valuable for looking at race in their own work, and thousands reported being actively involved in pushing for RSJI-related changes in their departments.
Okay, 83% finding it valuable is pretty high, especially given the initial resistance. That suggests it moved beyond just grudging compliance for many people.
It seems so. It laid the foundation for the next phase, embedding it into operations.
Right. So people are trained, the conversation is happening, maybe still uncomfortably, but it's happening. How did they make sure this translated into actual changes in how departments operated? How did they build in accountability beyond just attending training?
They needed concrete tools, systemic tools.
Hmm.
The initiative really relied on two main mechanisms here, and they were linked. First, starting in 2005, every single city department had to develop an agency work plan for implementing RSJI.
Okay, a plan, but plans can sit on shelves, right?
True, but these weren't just suggestions. They were tied directly to performance. Key parts of these RSJI work plans were written into the annual performance evaluations of the department heads.
Ah, so if you're the director of, say, parks or transportation, and your department isn't making progress on its RSGI goals,
Your own job review, your potential raise or bonus, could be negatively impacted. That gets people's attention. It makes it non-optional for leadership.
okay, that embeds it at the top. What about further down in the departments?
That's where the second piece comes in. Change teams. Each department had to create a change team. These weren't just managers. They were made up of employees from all levels, frontline staff, mid-level managers, analysts.
And their job was?
Their job was to guide the development and implementation of that department's work plan. They were the internal engine. And their work kind of forced the department to admit to something.
What do you mean, admit to something?
Well, to make a meaningful plan, the change team had to identify specific policies, practices, or procedures within their own department that were creating racial inequities. They couldn't just talk in generalities. They had to point to concrete examples, or the whole plan would sound, bogus, as the source says.
Okay, so they had to find the institutional racism in their own house. I bet that led to some easy targets first.
Absolutely. Predictably, many departments initially went for the low-hanging fruit. Things that were relatively easy to change, didn't require huge budget shifts or challenging powerful interests. That's natural, but the structure pushed them to eventually tackle harder stuff.
Still, even with plans and teams, you're going to get resistance, especially in a big bureaucracy. What form did that take?
The most common kind wasn't open defiance. It was more subtle. Staff actually gave it a couple of names. The City of Seattle, nice resistance. Or, my favorite, the bobblehead phenomena.
The bobblehead phenomenon. Okay, explain that.
Picture a meeting. Everyone's nodding along. Yes, great idea. Absolutely, we need to do this. Big smiles, total agreement. Bobbleheads nodding. Yes, yes, yes. But then they go back to their desks and just keep doing things the exact same way, the same old, same old. If questioned, they might say, oh, well, budget cuts. Or, we're just swamped right now. Passive-aggressive compliance. Agree in the room.
Yeah.
Do nothing. Back at the desk.
Right. The polite no, very common in organizations. So how did RSJI fight the bobbleheads? How did they enforce real action against that kind of invisible resistance?
They used public accountability and, frankly, a bit of shame. Departments had to submit quarterly progress reports on their RSJI work plans directly to the city council.
Okay.
And here's the kicker. Those city council committee meetings where these reports were discussed, they were televised.
Ah, public exposure.
Exactly. It created this powerful peer pressure dynamic among the department heads. Nobody wanted to be the director up there on TV trying to explain to the council why their department was lagging behind on addressing institutional racism while all their peers were reporting progress. It forced them to at least appear active, inclusive, and enlightened as possible, as the source puts it.
That's a clever bureaucratic maneuvering, using transparency as a lever. Okay, so plans, teams, public reporting. But what about the money? How did they make sure RSJI wasn't just a policy goal but actually influenced budget decisions?
This is probably the most critical step for making it permanent, for really institutionalizing it. First, they focused the work around 5 central concerns. These were like strategic pillars: workforce equity, economic equity, immigrant refugee services, public engagement, and capacity building.
So broad areas covering internal and external stuff.
Right. Then, to make sure spending aligned with these, Mayor Nichols mandated the use of something called the RSJI Policy and Budget Filter.
A filter. Okay, what did that actually involve? If I'm a manager writing up a budget request, what did I have to do?
It was pretty direct. When you submitted a budget issue paper, a BIP, the standard way to propose new spending or policy, you had to include answers to specific questions from this RSJI filter.
Like what kind of question?
Questions designed to make you explicitly consider the equity impact before the money was approved. Things like, who benefits from this proposal and who might be burdened by it? And critically, what is the potential impact of this proposal on racial equity?
So you couldn't just propose something without thinking through or at least writing down how it might affect different racial groups.
Exactly. It forced managers to screen their own proposals for potential unintended negative consequences. Could this new program accidentally harm communities of color? Does this budget cut fall disproportionately on certain neighborhoods? It built equity analysis right into the DNA of the budget process.
Can you give an example of how this played out in a regular city department? Something not HR related, maybe, like utilities.
Yeah, the Seattle Public Utilities SBU example is perfect because it's so operational. SBU created something called the Service Equity Team Study, or SETS.
Okay, what did SETS study?
They looked at the most basic core functions of the utility. How often do water mains break? Where are sewer backups happening most? Are garbage pickups being missed more in certain areas?
So basic service delivery.
Right. And they mapped this data geographically, breaking it down by census block. Then they correlated it. Is there a relationship between lower levels of service, more outages, more missed pickups, and the racial or ethnic makeup of a neighborhood? Or income levels? Or geographic location?
And if they found, say, that predominantly Black or Latino neighborhoods were experiencing worse service.
Then the RSJI mandate kicked in. SBU couldn't just say, oh, that's interesting. They were required to change how they allocated resources, adjust repair schedules, rethink maintenance protocols, whatever it took to address that systemic inequity in basic service delivery.
Wow. So it literally made racial equity part of ensuring the water runs and the garbage gets picked up.
That's it. It moved equity from a special project into just regular government work.
Okay, so they had the mandate, the training, the tools like work plans and budget filters. They pushed it down into operations like utilities. After doing this for years, what actually changed? What were some of the concrete results across those central concerns?
The results highlighted in the chapter, they're pretty substantial and cover a lot of ground. Let's start with economic equity, that goal of spreading city money around more fairly.
Right, the WMBE contracting.
Yeah. By really focusing on using women and minority-owned business enterprises for city contracts, not just construction, but all goods and services, they saw a huge jump. Between 2006 and 2011, the money going to WMBEs tripled. Went from about $11 million a year to $34 million.
Tripled. That's not small change. That requires fundamentally changing how you write bids, how you find vendors.
Oh yeah, it's a big operational shift in procurement. Then look at workforce equity, changing who the city hires and promotes. They tackled some really specific institutional barriers.
Like the background checks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They realized that requiring criminal background checks for all city jobs was disproportionately screening out applicants of color, given disparities in the justice system. So they changed the policy. Background checks were only required if the conviction was directly related to the specific job duties.
That must have opened up a lot of doors.
Thousands of opportunities, potentially. And another example there, again from Seattle Public Utilities, they seem to have been real leaders in this.
What did SBU do on hiring?
They actually went back and analyzed their job descriptions. And they found positions where they were requiring a college degree. But when they really looked at the day-to-day work, the degree wasn't truly necessary to do the job well.
Ah, the unnecessary credential barrier.
Right, which also tends to disproportionately screen out people of color and folks from lower income backgrounds. So they removed the degree requirement for those positions, focusing instead on skills and experience. Small change on paper, potentially big impact on who could apply and get hired.
Okay, smart systemic tweaks. What about immigrant services?
There, the focus was really practical. Accessibility. Language barriers are a huge institutional failure, if you think about it. So the city started translating critical documents about services, how to pay your bills, get permits, access programs into like 30 different languages.
30 languages, wow.
And it wasn't just brochures. They made sure essential field staff, like boiler inspectors going into small businesses, actually carried translation cards with them, so they could communicate basic safety requirements with business owners who might not speak much English.
That's embedding equity into the most routine, day-to-day city functions, making sure everyone can interact with the city.
Exactly. And then the changes in the criminal justice system, these really show how analyzing seemingly neutral rules through an RSJI lens can uncover and mitigate disproportionate impacts.
You mean like the 364-day sentence thing? I found that fascinating. Can you explain that again?
Yeah, it's a brilliant example of systemic thinking at the local level interacting with federal law. The city attorney's office realized that under federal immigration law, a criminal sentence of 365 days or more could automatically trigger deportation proceedings for a non-citizen, even for relatively minor offenses, like gross misdemeanors handled at the city level.
Okay, 1 year triggers deportation.
Right, so the city attorney's office implemented a policy. For certain gross misdemeanors, prosecutors would seek a sentence of 364 days, not 365, just 1 day less.
Why? What does that 1 day do?
That 1 day difference meant the conviction often no longer met the threshold for triggering automatic deportation under federal law. It still allowed the city to impose a significant local penalty, nearly a full year in jail, but it strategically avoided tripping that wire for a potentially devastating, life-altering federal consequence that disproportionately affected immigrant communities.
Wow, that's using local policy very precisely to shield residents from a harsher, racially disparate federal impact. Very
Yes.
clever.
Deeply clever. And along similar lines, they also decided to stop prosecuting simple marijuana possession and, importantly, driving with a suspended license if the suspension was just for failure to pay fines.
Why stop prosecuting those?
Because they recognized these low-level offenses didn't really pose a public safety threat, but they were disproportionately trapping poor people and people of color in cycles of debt, warrants, and minor convictions that could then snowball into bigger problems like job loss or, again, immigration issues. It was clogging the system and hurting specific communities without much public benefit.
So, using prosecutorial discretion through an equity lens. Okay, these are all significant results. But then comes the big test, right? 2009. Mayor Nichols, the founder, the political muscle, he loses his re-election bid.
Yeah, he didn't even make it past the primary. Huge shock. And suddenly, the entire RSJI initiative looks incredibly vulnerable. The person who drove it is gone. What happens under a new mayor who maybe didn't campaign on this, maybe doesn't feel ownership?
That's always the question with founder-driven initiatives, isn't it? How do you make it stick beyond the individual? How did RSJI survive?
It survived because, in the interim, they had successfully institutionalized it through policy. Specifically, in November 2009, right after Nichols lost, but before the new mayor took office, the city council passed Resolution 31164.
Okay, a resolution, what did it do?
It was politically savvy. The resolution formally affirmed the city's ongoing commitment to RSJI. It directed all city departments to continue the work, to keep tracking progress on those key indicators, health, education, employment, etc., regardless of who was in the mayor's office.
So the council basically locked it in place, made it official city policy, not just one mayor's pet project.
Exactly. They transformed it from a mayoral initiative, which can be fragile, into a mandated City of Seattle endeavor. They cemented it in city law and policy.
And did the new mayor, Mike McGinn, try to dismantle it, or did he go along?
He actually embraced it. And the proof of that came during the big recession budget crisis of 2010-2011. The city was facing major shortfalls, looking at deep cuts.
A perfect excuse to ditch a soft initiative like RSJI, maybe.
You'd think so. But McGinn did the opposite. He required departments to use another tool developed under RSJI, the Racial Equity Toolkit, specifically to analyze the potential impact of any proposed budget cuts.
Wait, another toolkit? How's that different from the budget filter?
The filter is more like a quick screening tool you use when proposing new things. The toolkit is a much more in-depth impact assessment process you use for big decisions, especially ones likely to have negative consequences, like layoffs or cutting services. McGinn basically said if you're going to cut something, you first have to analyze who it's going to hurt most from a racial equity perspective, and you have to try to mitigate that harm.
Wow. So instead of abandoning it during a crisis, he used its tools to manage the crisis more equitably.
Precisely. And that moment, using the equity tools to make tough decisions about cuts, that really showed RSJI had become truly institutionalized. It wasn't just for good times. It was part of how the city operated, period.
So surviving the founder's departure, being locked in by the council, and then being actively used by new leadership during a fiscal crisis, that really does sound like it moved from being just a program to being part of the city's DNA.
Yeah, an administrator quoted in the chapter said the city really turned a corner when the new leadership owned it like that. It wasn't just an action plan anymore, likely to fade away. It was now just what we plan to do. That's successful institutionalization. Hashtag, outro. So when we pull all this together, thinking about it from a public policy and management perspective, the Seattle story offers some really clear lessons about government accountability and trying to make systemic change actually happen. The chapter boils it down to about 5 key conclusions.
Okay, let's quickly recap those takeaways. What's number one?
Number one, and maybe the most obvious but still crucial, you absolutely need unwavering commitment from senior leadership. Mayor Nichols providing that political muscle early on, especially against the legal resistance, was non-negotiable. Without that top-level backing, it likely would have died before it even started.
Right. Political will is paramount. Second.
Second, the strategy of starting with internal examination of institutional racism is probably the right first step. That get our own house in order approach. It built credibility for the city, and just as importantly, it built the internal skills and understanding needed before they could effectively engage with the wider community.
Makes sense. Clean your own house first. Third takeaway.
Third is a reality check for anyone wanting to do this work. Starting racial equity work is incredibly hard. You will encounter nervousness, resistance, conflict, whether it's open pushback or that passive-aggressive bobblehead stuff. It's predictable, and you can't shy away from it. You have to plan for it and navigate it directly. The emotional labor is real and has to be managed.
Okay, expect resistance and plan for it. Fourth,
A key early sign that you're making progress is when you start normalizing conversations about race. When the organization moves from a place where just saying the words institutional racism causes paralysis or outrage to a place where people can discuss it, analyze it, maybe still uncomfortably but professionally, as part of the job that normalization is critical for doing the actual policy work.
getting past the taboo stage.
And the fifth conclusion,
And fifth, the payoff. Results take time, but if you stick with it, sustained commitment leads to significant change. The Seattle example shows it wasn't quick, but years of applying the tools led to real shifts in contracts and hiring and service delivery, even in things like misdemeanor sentencing. Real, tangible outcomes.
so patience and persistence pay off. The ultimate goal, as the chapter suggests, is getting everyone, even those who don't initially care about it, to see racial equity work as just normal government work.
Part of doing the job well.
Exactly. Competent management includes equity management.
The whole RSJI story really demonstrates that deep structural change is possible inside government, even with all the inertia and resistance. But there's this one final analogy from the source material shared by one of the trainers that I think is a really powerful thought for you, the listener, to take away.
Yeah, it's a good one.
They said basically that institutions often seem solid and movable, right? Like granite, but they're not always as invulnerable as we think. Change can happen fast, sometimes in one swoop, if you build up enough pressure, if you have the right elements in place at the right time. It's possible, they argued, to literally transform the organization at these critical moments. And the Seattle case study, really, it's proof of concept. It shows that if you have the right strategy, if you have accountability tools like the budget filter or the equity toolkit, if you use language carefully, and if you have that sustained leadership, profound systemic transformation isn't just a dream. It's actually achievable. So the question left for you, thinking as a current or future policy manager, isn't really if this kind of change is possible in your own organization. The question is, how quickly and how strategically can you build that necessary institutional commitment to make it happen?